Every seat was taken, except the one beside her. The words didn't need to be spoken out loud. Lena Whitmore could feel them in the way the hall shifted around her, in the subtle turning of shoulders, in the careful avoidance of eyes. The mating ceremony had already begun, and the great hall of Thornridge Pack pulsed with heat and expectation, torches flickering along stone walls that had witnessed generations of bonds, alliances, and whispered betrayals. Silk brushed against silk as pairs formed. Laughter rose in soft bursts, and the scent of anticipation hung thick in the air like the first hint of a summer storm. And yet, at the far edge of the room, where the shadows gathered just enough to soften the light, Lena stood alone. Her hands rested loosely at her sides, fingers curled just enough to keep them from trembling, her gaze fixed somewhere just above the crowd, as if she were watching something far beyond this place. She had chosen that spot deliberately, close enough to be seen, far enough to be forgotten. It was a balance she had perfected over the years. Close enough to obey the rules, far enough to survive them. Her name had already been called once, clear and formal, echoing through the hall with all the ceremony it deserved. Lena Whitmore. The words had carried weight, tradition, expectation. But when the silence followed, thick, unbroken, absolute, it had said everything else. No one stepped forward. Not a single shift of movement. Not a single claim. Just the faint scrape of a boot somewhere in the crowd and the quiet rustle of someone turning away. Lena had felt it like a physical thing, pressing against her ribs, but she hadn't moved. She never did, because leaving would have meant they were right. And she refused to give them that. A quiet laugh rippled from somewhere behind her, low enough to pretend it wasn't meant for her, sharp enough that it couldn't be mistaken. Another voice followed, softer but cruel in its certainty. No scent. No pull. Why would anyone choose her? Lena's jaw tightened, but her expression didn't change. She kept her chin level, her shoulders relaxed, as if the words slid past her without leaving a mark. Inside, though, her breath slowed deliberately, measured, controlled. In for 4. Hold. Out for 4. She had learned that, too. How to make the storm inside her look like still water. Across the hall, another pair stepped forward, hands brushing, laughter blooming between them as the officiant nodded in approval. Applause followed, warm, easy, deserved. Lena didn't look at them. She didn't look at anyone. Instead, her gaze drifted briefly to the empty space beside her, the space that should have been filled by now, the space that told the entire story without a single word. She could feel the weight of it, like an outline carved into the air. The place where someone should have stood. The place where no one ever did. A server passed by with a tray of glasses, offering polite smiles to everyone except her, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. People didn't see what they weren't looking for. And no one was looking for Lena Whitmore. Still, she stayed. She didn't shrink further into the shadows. She didn't lower her head. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, grounding herself, and lifted her chin just a fraction higher. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but it was enough. Enough to say she was still here. Enough to say she hadn't broken. The music swelled again, strings rising and falling in practiced harmony, and for a moment, it almost drowned out the quiet truth echoing in the space around her. Almost. Because even as the hall filled with connection, with warmth, with chosen bonds, Lena remained exactly where she had started. Unclaimed, unseen, and utterly alone. And still she did not leave. The officiant's voice carried across the hall once more, steady and practiced, calling the next name with ceremonial precision, and the crowd responded exactly as expected, attention shifting, bodies turning, interest flowing like a current that never once reached the edge where Lena stood, and for a moment she wondered if she had already faded completely from the room, if she had become nothing more than a shape that occupied space without meaning. But then a pair of eyes flicked toward her. From across the marble floor, lingered for half a second too long, and quickly looked away, as if even acknowledging her existence might invite something uncomfortable, something inconvenient, something that did not belong in a night meant for celebration. And that was how it always worked, not open cruelty, not direct rejection, but a quiet, practiced exclusion that settled into the bones over time, until it felt almost natural, almost deserved, almost inevitable. And Lena refused to let that last part take root, refused to let herself believe that this was all she was meant for, Because if she did, then there would be nothing left to stand on, nothing left to hold together the fragile line of dignity she had built piece by piece, year after year, silence after silence. So she inhaled slowly again, steadying herself, letting the sounds of the hall wash over her without pulling her under, the music, the laughter, the soft murmur of voices weaving together in patterns she had memorized but never joined. And somewhere near the center of the room, another bond was being formed. Another pair stepping forward under the warm glow of torchlight, their hands brushing in a way that drew a collective sigh from the crowd, approval rising like a wave. And Lena felt the echo of it in her chest, not longing exactly, not anymore, but something quieter, something that pressed against the edges of her ribs and then settled back into stillness. Because wanting something that never came had long ago stopped being useful, and yet there was a small, stubborn part of her that refused to go completely silent, a part that watched, that measured, that wondered what it might feel like to be chosen not out of obligation or pity, but because someone saw her and did not turn away, and that thought lingered just long enough to be dangerous before she pushed it aside, grounding herself again in what was real, in the cool weight of the stone beneath her feet, in the faint brush of fabric against her wrists, in the steady rhythm of her own breathing. And it was in that moment, when she was most focused on holding herself together, that a shift began to ripple through the room, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a slight hesitation in the music, a pause in conversation that spread outward like a quiet ripple across still water. And Lena felt it before she understood it. The way the air seemed to tighten, the way attention began to redirect, not toward the center where it belonged, but toward the entrance at the far end of the hall. And she did not turn immediately, because she had learned not to chase attention that was not meant for her, had learned that curiosity could easily turn into another kind of humiliation if it was misplaced. So she kept her gaze forward, steady, even as the silence deepened, even as the weight of something unspoken settled over the crowd, pressing down on every conversation until it fractured and fell away entirely. And only then, when the stillness became impossible to ignore, did Lena allow her eyes to shift, just slightly, just enough to catch the change in the room, the way people were no longer looking at each other, but towards something else, something that had altered the balance of the entire space without a single word. And she felt it again, that tightening in her chest, not fear, not quite, but awareness, sharp and immediate, like the first drop of rain before a storm fully breaks. And for reasons she could not explain, her fingers stilled completely at her sides, her breath catching for just a fraction of a second before she forced it to steady once more, because whatever was happening, whatever had just entered this room, it was not meant for her. It never was. And yet the air itself seemed to shift in a way that made that certainty feel just a little less absolute. No one announced his arrival, yet the entire hall seemed to know, as if something deeper than sound had carried the message through every bone and breath in the room. And Lena felt it before she fully saw it, the way the air shifted from warm to sharp, from familiar to charged, like stepping outside just before a storm breaks over open land. And slowly, almost against her own instinct, her gaze followed the direction of everyone else's, moving toward the towering doors at the far end of the hall that now stood open just enough to let in a current of cold night air. And in that narrow space between torchlight and darkness, a figure stepped forward, unhurried, deliberate, each movement grounded in a kind of quiet authority that did not need to be announced to be understood. And even from where she stood, Lena could tell he was larger than the others, not only in height, but in presence, the kind that made space adjust around him without resistance, the kind that did not ask to be noticed because it always was. And the murmurs that followed were not loud, not chaotic, but restrained, careful, as if even speaking to freely might draw attention that no one wanted to invite. And Lena caught fragments of it drifting through the air, soft and uncertain. He was not expected, and why is he here tonight? And something else, something quieter, almost reverent, that is Cale Thornridge. And the name landed differently than the others, heavier, carrying with it a weight she could not fully explain but immediately understood, because even she, standing at the farthest edge of importance, had heard it before, not in conversation but in the way people lowered their voices when they spoke it, in the way stories changed tone when it was mentioned, as if it belonged to something more than just a man, and Lena's breath slowed without her telling it to, her body instinctively stilling in a way she had never practiced, because this was not like the others, not like the alphas who had already made their choices tonight, not like the ones who laughed or looked away or pretended not to see her. This was something else entirely, something that shifted the rules of the room without needing to state them. And she told herself not to stare, told herself to look away, to remain as she had been, unnoticed, unaffected. But her eyes lingered for just a fraction too long, long enough to catch the details she should not have cared about. The dark coat that moved with him instead of against him, the straight line of his posture, the stillness in his shoulders that suggested control rather than tension, and most of all, the way the crowd responded without being told, bodies subtly repositioning, conversations dissolving mid-sentence, attention narrowing like a lens focusing on a single point. And Lena felt the difference immediately, because for the first time that night, she was no longer the most invisible person in the room. And yet somehow, that did not make her feel safer, because whatever attention had shifted away from her had not disappeared. It had simply found a new center, one that drew everything toward it. And she could feel that pull even from where she stood, subtle but undeniable, like gravity adjusting just enough to be noticed. And she tightened her fingers again, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because something had changed, something fundamental. And she did not know yet whether that change would pass over her like everything else always did, or if this time, somehow, it would not. And the thought came uninvited, sharp and fleeting, before she pushed it down again, reminding herself of the only truth that had ever remained consistent, that nights like this did not turn in her favor, that stories like this did not include someone like her. And yet, as Cale Thornridge stepped fully into the light, bringing the quiet with him as if it followed in his wake, Lena could not ignore the way the space around her seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something that had not happened yet, but was already on its way. The music did not stop, but it softened, as if even the instruments understood that something more important had entered the room, and Lena could feel the shift settling deeper now, no longer a ripple, but a quiet command that pressed against every movement, every breath. And she watched without meaning to as Cale Thornridge moved forward, not toward the center where the ceremony continued, but along the outer edge of the hall, his path cutting through space that seemed to open for him without hesitation, people stepping aside before he reached them, their smiles fading into something more controlled, more careful. And it struck Lena then that this was not admiration in the way she had seen before, not the easy warmth given to favored alphas or chosen pairs. This was something steadier, something edged with respect that bordered on restraint, as if everyone present understood that this was not a man to be approached lightly. And she felt that understanding settle into her as well, instinctive and immediate, even though she had never stood this close to him before, never been in the same room at the same moment, and still, her body recognized it. The way her shoulders straightened just a fraction more, the way her breathing adjusted again, quieter now, more deliberate, as if making too much noise might somehow draw attention she was not prepared to hold. And that thought alone should have been enough to make her look away, to return to the safety of invisibility she had relied on all night. But something held her there, something small and stubborn that refused to retreat this time. And she told herself it was nothing more than curiosity, that it meant nothing, that it would pass like everything else. But even as she tried to believe that, her eyes tracked him again, just for a second, just long enough to notice that he was not looking at anyone in particular, not engaging, not acknowledging the subtle gestures of respect offered in his direction. And that in itself was strange, because every other alpha in this room had come to be seen, to be chosen, to make a claim or accept one. And yet Cale Thornridge moved as if none of that applied to him, as if the ceremony itself was something he observed rather than participated in. And Lena felt that difference settle somewhere deeper than thought, because if he was not here to choose, then why had he come at all? And the question lingered just long enough to feel real before she pushed it aside again, reminding herself that it did not matter, that whatever reason had brought him here had nothing to do with her, that it never would. And still, the air around her seemed to tighten further, not from the crowd this time, but from something else, something closer. And she realized, slowly, that his path had not remained distant, that step by step, without drawing attention to it, he had moved along the outer edge of the hall in a way that brought him closer to where she stood, and her fingers stilled completely now, her breath catching again, softer this time but sharper, because proximity changed everything, because distance had allowed her to observe without consequence. But this was different. This was real in a way that made her suddenly aware of every small detail she had been ignoring. The way her dress fell against her shoulders, the way her posture might be read, the way standing alone at the edge of the room might look from someone else's perspective. And for the first time that night, uncertainty flickered through her control, brief but undeniable. And she resisted the instinct to step back, to retreat further into shadow. Because that would be noticed, and being noticed for the wrong reason had never ended well. So instead she held her ground, steady, composed, as if nothing had changed, as if the space between them had not quietly disappeared. And then, without warning, the subtle movement of the crowd shifted again, not outward this time, but inward, a narrowing that redirected attention not toward the center of the ceremony, but toward the outer edge where she stood, and Lena felt it like a shift in gravity. The way eyes began to turn, one by one, not because she had done anything, but because something else had aligned around her, and she did not need to look to know why, did not need to confirm it to feel the truth of it settle into her chest, because Cale Thornridge had stopped moving, and he had stopped close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance at all. For a single second, Lena did not move, because movement would have meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have meant this moment was real, and she was not ready for that. Not when every instinct she had spent years building told her that this could not possibly be meant for her, that whatever had drawn Cale Thornridge to this side of the hall had nothing to do with the Omegas standing quietly in the shadows. And yet the silence around her said otherwise, the way the air held, the way the low murmur of voices had completely faded, the way attention pressed in from every direction like a weight she could feel along her shoulders, and slowly, carefully, she lifted her gaze, not fully, not directly, but enough to confirm what she already knew, that he was there, that he had stopped, and that the distance between them was close enough now that she could see details she had not been meant to notice, the sharp line of his jaw, the stillness in his expression, the kind of control that did not need to announce itself to be understood, and her breath faltered for just a fraction of a second before she steadied it again, because losing control now, even in something as small as breathing, would be seen, and being seen had never worked in her favor. So she anchored herself, grounding through the familiar, the feel of the floor beneath her shoes, the quiet tension in her hands, the steady rhythm she forced back into her chest, and still, the question pressed forward, unwanted and impossible to ignore. Why here? Why now? Why her? And she tried to dismiss it, tried to return to the safety of certainty, but certainty was slipping, dissolving in the presence of something that did not follow the patterns she understood. And then, before she could fully decide what to do with that, she felt it, not a touch, not yet, but a shift in proximity so subtle it might have been imagined if not for the way her awareness sharpened instantly, because he had moved again, just one step, but it was enough to place him directly beside her, close enough that the space between them was no longer empty but shared, and the change in the room was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Like a line had been drawn that no one else would cross, and Lena felt the eyes on them now. Unmistakable, the kind of attention that did not scatter but fixed, watching, waiting, and for the first time that night, her composure wavered, not outwardly, not in any way most would notice, but inside, where the careful balance she had held began to shift under the weight of something entirely new. Because this was not exclusion, this was not absence, this was the opposite, and she did not yet know what to do with it, did not know how to stand in it without losing the control she had relied on for so long. An instinct told her to step away, to create distance, to return to what was safe and known, but something stronger held her in place, something that felt less like a choice and more like gravity. And then, just as that tension reached its sharpest point, his voice broke the silence, low, steady, close enough that it did not carry across the hall, but it did not need to, because it was meant for her, and only her, and the words were simple, almost casual, but they landed with a weight that shifted everything. Stand still. And Lena did, not because she was told to, not because she had to, but because in that moment, it was the only thing that made sense, the only way to hold on to the fragile line of control she had left, and she became very aware of every detail, the way her shoulders aligned, the way her chin lifted just slightly, the way her hands relaxed at her sides, and she did not look at him fully, did not turn, but she did not step away either, and that, more than anything, seemed to settle something in the space between them, a quiet confirmation that neither of them spoke aloud, and around them, the room remained still, waiting, watching, as if everyone understood that whatever happened next would not belong to the ceremony anymore, but to this moment, this shift, this unexpected alignment that no one had anticipated and no one could interrupt. The words settled between them, simple and quiet, yet heavier than anything else spoken that night, and Lena felt them echo through her chest, not as a command she resisted, but as something she instinctively aligned with, as if her body recognized a rhythm before her mind could question it, and she remained exactly where she was, shoulders steady, chin slightly lifted, her breathing measured and controlled, even as awareness sharpened around every detail of the moment, because now there was no denying it, no retreating into the comfort of invisibility, no pretending this was happening somewhere else, to someone else, because it was happening to her, and the realization carried a strange dual weight, part disbelief, part clarity, like stepping into a light that was too bright at first but impossible to ignore once it touched you. And she could feel the attention of the room pressing closer, no longer scattered, no longer uncertain, but focused, anchored on the space they now shared. And for a brief moment, the instinct to shrink returned, a quiet urge to make herself smaller, to ease the pressure by disappearing just enough to let it pass. But she did not move, because something in his presence made that instinct feel unnecessary, even incorrect, and that alone was unfamiliar enough to unsettle her, because she had always relied on that instinct to survive, had built her entire composure around it, and now, standing beside him, she felt it loosen, not vanish, but soften in a way that left her unsure of what to replace it with. And her gaze remained forward, not out of defiance, not out of fear, but because turning too quickly, reacting too visibly, would break the fragile balance she had just managed to find, and she sensed, without needing to look, that he was watching her, not in the way others had before, not dismissive, not curious in a shallow sense, but attentive in a way that felt deliberate, as if he were measuring something beyond appearance, beyond rank, beyond the assumptions that had defined her place in this world for as long as she could remember. And the thought should have made her uneasy, should have made her retreat, but instead it steadied her, grounding her further into the moment rather than pulling her away from it. And she let that steadiness settle, let it shape the way she stood, the way she held herself, until the tension that had once felt sharp began to smooth into something quieter, something more controlled, and around them, the ceremony had not resumed, though no one had officially called for a pause. It simply existed in suspension now. The music reduced to a soft, uncertain thread, the officiant silent, the gathered pairs no longer the focus of attention, because everything had shifted, everything had narrowed to this unexpected alignment at the edge of the hall, and Lena became aware of the way the silence held not confusion, but anticipation, as if everyone present understood that something significant was unfolding, even if they did not yet know what shape it would take, and that awareness settled into her as well, not as pressure, but as clarity, because for the first time that night, she was not reacting to what others expected of her. She was simply present within the moment itself, and that difference, small as it might have seemed, changed everything about the way she experienced it. And then, without warning, she felt it, the lightest shift of movement beside her, followed by the briefest contact at her side, not forceful, not invasive, but firm enough to be unmistakable, his hand resting just above her waist, steady and deliberate. And her breath caught again, sharper this time, but she did not pull away, did not tense, because the contact did not carry threat. It carried intent, clear and undeniable, and the reaction from the room was immediate, a ripple of stunned silence that deepened rather than broke, as if no one dared to interrupt what they were witnessing. and Lena felt the weight of that moment settle fully into place, because whatever uncertainty had existed before was gone now, replaced by something far more defined, far more impossible to ignore. And still, she held her posture, her composure, her quiet control, because if this moment was real, if this shift truly belonged to her, then she would meet it standing, not shrinking, not fading, but exactly as she was, steady, present, and unbroken. The contact did not fade, and that alone was enough to make the moment feel irreversible, because Lena had spent years learning the language of distance, the subtle signals that defined who belonged and who did not. And this was not distance. This was presence, unmistakable and deliberate, and she could feel it in the steady warmth of his hand at her side, in the way it did not shift or hesitate, as if the placement itself was a statement rather than a gesture, and the room responded to it immediately, not with noise, but with a deeper stillness that carried far more weight than any reaction could have, because silence like this was not empty. It was full, filled with recognition, with shock, with the quiet recalibration of everything that had been assumed just moments before, and Lena felt that shift ripple outward, not only through the crowd but through herself as well, because for the first time that night, she was no longer standing outside the structure of the ceremony. She was inside it, at the center of something she had never been meant to touch, and the realization pressed against her carefully maintained composure, testing it, stretching it, asking whether it would hold or fracture under the sudden weight of attention. An instinct told her to pull away, to break the contact before it defined her in a way she could not control. But something stronger held her still, something quieter and more certain, because the way he stood beside her did not feel like a mistake, did not feel like an accident that would correct itself if she stepped aside. It felt intentional, grounded, as if he had already decided something that the rest of the room was only beginning to understand, and that certainty steadied her more than it unsettled her, anchoring her in place when everything else suggested she should move. And she became aware of the way her posture shifted almost imperceptibly in response, her shoulders aligning more naturally, her stance adjusting not to make herself smaller, but to match the space she now occupied. And it was subtle, so subtle that only someone watching closely might notice. But it changed the way she felt within her own skin, because for the first time, she was not trying to disappear, she was simply standing, and that difference, quiet as it was, carried a weight she had never experienced before. And around them, the whispers began again, not loud enough to break the silence, but present enough to be felt. Fragments of disbelief and confusion threading through the air, questions forming without answers. Why her? And that is Lena Whitmore. And she was not chosen. And the words should have cut, should have reopened the familiar edge of humiliation she had known so well, but they did not land the same way this time, because they were no longer directed at someone overlooked. They were directed at something the crowd did not understand, and that shifted their meaning entirely, turning them from dismissal into uncertainty, and Lena felt that distinction settle into her, changing the way she held herself just a fraction more. And then, as if responding to the growing tension, his hand adjusted. Slightly, not tightening, not claiming more space than it already held, but steadying in a way that grounded the moment further. And she felt the shift through her breath, through the rhythm of her heartbeat, through the quiet alignment of her stance. And for the first time since he had stepped beside her, she allowed herself to turn her head, just enough to meet his gaze. And what she found there was not what she had expected. Not dominance in the way others displayed it, not cold dismissal or detached interest, but something far more controlled, far more deliberate, a focus that did not waver, that did not question, that simply existed, as if he had already made a decision and saw no need to explain it. And that steadiness held her for a brief second longer than she intended, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, something she could not name but instinctively understood. And then she looked forward again, not out of avoidance, but out of awareness, because the moment was no longer just between them. It belonged to the entire room now, and every eye was waiting, every breath held, every expectation shifting toward what would come next. And Lena felt that anticipation settle fully into place, because whatever this was, whatever he had chosen to begin by stepping beside her, it was not finished yet, and the next move would define everything. The silence stretched just long enough to become something fragile, something that could break if anyone dared to move too quickly. And Lena felt it in the way the room held itself, in the way even the smallest sounds seemed to hesitate before existing. And for a moment, she thought perhaps nothing else would happen, that this strange alignment would remain suspended without resolution. But then a voice cut through the stillness, sharp enough to shift the balance, controlled enough to pretend it belonged. Is this some kind of mistake? And the words did not come from the center of the hall, not from the officiant or any of the chosen pairs, but from somewhere closer, somewhere within the circle of attention that had formed around them. And Lena did not turn immediately, because she did not need to. She could feel the direction of it, the intent behind it, the way it carried just enough challenge to test the moment without openly confronting it. And a second voice followed, quieter but edged with the same disbelief. She has not been claimed. And the statement hung in the air like a fact meant to restore order, to remind everyone of the rules that had governed the ceremony until now. And for a fraction of a second, the old instinct returned, the familiar tightening in her chest that came with being reduced to a status, to a category that defined her limits before she could speak for herself. But it did not take hold the same way it used to, because the presence beside her had already shifted those boundaries, already altered the space in a way that could not be undone by a few uncertain voices. And she felt that realization settle into her posture, steadying her rather than shrinking her. And still, the tension in the room sharpened, not outwardly, not in any dramatic display, but in the way attention narrowed even further, waiting to see whether those words would be answered, whether the fragile balance of the moment would hold or fracture under the weight of doubt. And Lena remained still, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood, instinctively, that this was not her moment to speak, that whatever had been set into motion did not belong to her voice. And the awareness of that did not feel like silence forced upon her. It felt like restraint chosen. And that distinction mattered more than she could have explained. And beside her, the steady presence did not shift, did not pull away, did not respond with immediate correction. And that pause, that deliberate lack of reaction, carried more authority than any interruption could have, because it made the entire room wait, made every eye remain fixed, made every expectation stretch just a little further. And Lena felt it again, that tightening of anticipation, that sense that something was about to break through the surface of this carefully held moment. And then, finally, his voice came, not raised, not sharp, but clear enough that it did not need volume to carry. No. And the single word settled into the room with quiet certainty, not dismissing the question, not arguing it, simply replacing it. And the effect was immediate. The tension did not vanish, but it shifted, redirecting itself away from uncertainty and towards something more defined, something that no longer asked whether this moment should exist, but what it meant now that it did. And Lena felt the difference as clearly as she felt his hand at her side, because the room was no longer questioning her presence. It was adjusting to it, recalibrating around a reality it had not anticipated. And the whispers did not return in the same way. They softened, changed, as if people were reconsidering what they thought they understood, and she remained where she was, steady, composed, not because she had no reason to move, but because for the first time, she did not feel the need to. And that alone felt like a shift she would not have believed possible just minutes ago. And as the silence settled again, deeper this time, more grounded, Lena became aware that whatever came next would not be challenged the same way, because the question had already been answered, and the answer had not left room for doubt. The single word settled deeper than any argument could have, and Lena felt the shift immediately, not in the volume of the room, but in its direction, because doubt had been replaced, not erased, but redirected into something quieter, something that no longer questioned whether she belonged in this moment, but struggled to understand why. And that distinction changed everything. Because she was no longer standing against the weight of disbelief, she was standing inside it. And for the first time, it did not press her down, it held her in place, steady, defined by something she had not chosen, but could no longer deny. And her breath moved slower now, not forced, not controlled in the same deliberate way as before, but naturally aligned with the stillness around her. as if the tension that had once required effort to manage had shifted into something she could stand within without breaking. And she became aware again of the hand at her side, not as a surprise anymore, not as something new, but as something constant, something that anchored the moment in a way nothing else could, and she did not question it now, did not analyze it. She simply accepted its presence as part of the reality unfolding around her, and that acceptance settled into her posture, into the way her shoulders remained level, into the way her stance no longer sought balance but already held it, and across the hall, the officiant shifted slightly, uncertain, as if waiting for permission to continue or instruction to stop, but neither came, and that silence from the one person meant to guide the ceremony confirmed what everyone else had already begun to understand, that the ceremony was no longer following its expected path, that something else had taken precedence, something that did not require formal acknowledgement to override tradition, and Lena felt the weight of that realization ripple outward. Because this was not a moment that would be folded back into normalcy. This was a moment that would redefine it, and the thought should have overwhelmed her, should have fractured the careful composure she had built over years of being overlooked. But instead it clarified something inside her, something that had always been there, but never had the space to exist fully, a quiet strength that did not come from being chosen, but from enduring long enough to stand when it finally happened, and that strength held now, steady and unshaken, even as the attention of the room remained fixed, even as the expectations around her continued to shift, and she felt it again, the subtle adjustment beside her, the way his presence remained grounded and unchanged despite the ripple of reactions spreading outward, as if none of it required his concern, as if the outcome had already been decided long before anyone else realized it. And that certainty, that unspoken assurance, settled into her more deeply than anything else, because it removed the last trace of doubt she might have held, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to consider what this meant, not in the abstract sense that the room was struggling to grasp, but in the immediate, personal way it touched her reality, and the thought was both simple and impossible at the same time, that she was no longer alone in this space, that the empty place beside her that had defined the entire night had been filled not by chance, not by obligation, but by something far more deliberate, and the realization moved through her slowly, not as a sudden shock, but as a steady unfolding, like light reaching into a place that had been shadowed for too long, and she did not rush it, did not try to define it too quickly, because she understood, instinctively, that whatever this was, it was not fragile. It did not need to be grasped or held tightly to remain real. It simply was, and that truth allowed her to stand without tension, without the constant calculation of how she was perceived, and for the first time since entering the hall, Lena Whitmore was not measuring herself against the expectations of others. She was simply present within the moment itself, fully, completely, and without apology, and as the silence settled once more, deeper and more grounded than before, she realized that whatever came next would not be something she endured. It would be something she stepped into, willingly, steadily, and without looking back. The shift came not with movement, but with intention, and Lena felt it before it was spoken, the way the air tightened just enough to signal that the moment was about to change again, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in a way that would leave no space for uncertainty. And beside her, Cale Thornridge did not remove his hand, did not step back, did not allow the fragile balance of the room to return to what it had been before. Instead, he moved forward, just one step, and the motion was small, controlled, but it carried weight, because it drew her with him without force, without pressure, simply by the quiet certainty of his direction. And for a fraction of a second, Lena hesitated, not visibly, not in a way that would draw attention, but internally, where instinct and reality met and did not quite align, because stepping forward meant crossing a line she had never been allowed to approach, meant leaving behind the safe edge where she had always remained, and yet the hesitation did not hold, because something deeper than habit responded first, something that recognized the steadiness beside her and chose to trust it, and she moved, not quickly, not reluctantly, but with the same controlled composure she had held all night, her steps measured, her posture aligned, her presence no longer tentative but grounded, and the room reacted immediately, not with sound, but with space, because the path before them opened without question. People shifting aside instinctively, not because they had been told to, but because the moment itself demanded it. And Lena felt the change with every step. The way the edge of the hall fell away behind her. The way the center of the room drew closer, not as something distant and unattainable, but as something she was now moving into. And the realization settled into her with a quiet clarity that steadied rather than overwhelmed, because she understood, in a way she had not before, that this was not about being placed somewhere she did not belong. This was about being brought into a space that had never been allowed to see her fully, and that difference mattered, and it showed in the way she carried herself, in the way her gaze remained level, not searching for approval, not avoiding the eyes that now followed her, but simply acknowledging the reality of the moment without shrinking from it. And beside her, his presence did not change, did not tighten or shift under the weight of attention. It remained constant, as if this path, this outcome, had already been decided long before anyone else understood it. And that certainty extended into her as well, anchoring her with each step until the tension that once defined her movements was replaced with something steadier, something quieter, something that did not need to prove itself to exist. And when they reached the center of the hall, the place where moments were meant to be seen and witnessed, Cale stopped, and Lena stopped with him, not because she was guided to, but because the motion felt complete, as if the path had always led here. And the silence that followed was different now, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but solid, grounded, filled with the understanding that something irreversible had just taken place. And Lena felt it settle into her fully, the awareness that there was no returning to the edge, no slipping back into the quiet invisibility she had once relied on, because that version of the night no longer existed. And for a brief second, the weight of that realization pressed against her, not as fear, but as something unfamiliar, something that asked her to stand differently, to exist differently within the space she now occupied. And she met it, without retreating, without hesitation, because she had already crossed the line that mattered, already stepped into the moment that defined everything else. And then, as if marking the shift in a way no one could misunderstand, his voice came again, low, steady, unmistakable, carrying just enough to reach beyond them. Stay close. And the words did not feel like instruction, they felt like confirmation, like the final piece of something that had already been set into place. And Lena did not question it, did not resist it. She simply remained where she was, exactly where she had been brought, standing beside him in the center of a room that no longer saw her as someone waiting to be chosen, but as someone who already had been. The center of the hall had never felt like a place meant for her, and yet as Lena stood there now, she realized it did not feel foreign in the way she had always imagined. It felt different, yes, but not unreachable, not impossible, as if the distance she had believed existed between herself and this space had never truly been about the room itself, but about who was allowed to stand within it. And that understanding settled into her slowly, grounding her in a way that steadied her breath and quieted the last lingering edges of doubt, because this was no longer something happening around her. It was something she was inside of, fully, undeniably. And beside her, Cale Thornridge remained exactly as he had been from the moment he stepped into her space, steady, unmoved by the weight of attention, as if the entire room adjusting to his presence was simply a natural consequence rather than an event. And Lena felt that steadiness extend to her again, not imposed, not forced, but offered in a way that allowed her to stand without second-guessing the ground beneath her feet. And across from them, the officiant finally shifted forward, hesitation still lingering in his posture, but overridden by the understanding that something had to be acknowledged, that silence could not hold forever. And when he spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone stepping into unfamiliar territory. "Alpha Thornridge," he began, pausing just slightly as if weighing the next words. "This ceremony follows a declared order." And the statement was respectful, measured, but beneath it lay the attempt to re-establish structure, to return the moment to something defined, something predictable. And Lena felt the subtle tension that followed, not sharp, not immediate, but present, like a held breath waiting to see if the structure would be accepted or dismissed. And beside her, Cale did not react instantly, did not interrupt or correct. And that pause again carried weight, because it made the entire room wait, made every expectation stretch just a little further before settling. And then, when he did respond, his voice was as controlled as before, low, steady, and unmistakably final. Then adjust it. And the words did not challenge the efficient, did not argue with tradition, they simply replaced it. As if the idea of altering the structure was not a disruption but a natural extension of his presence, and the effect was immediate. The officiant fell silent, not out of confusion, but out of recognition, because the authority behind those words did not leave space for negotiation, and the room followed that shift, the subtle tension dissolving into something more settled, more certain, as if everyone present understood that whatever rules had guided the ceremony before were no longer the ones in effect now. And Lena felt that realization move through her again, deeper this time, because this was no longer a moment of uncertainty, no longer a question waiting to be answered. It was a declaration, not spoken in grand terms, but carried through action and presence, and she became aware of the way the room no longer looked at her with confusion, but with something else, something that resembled acknowledgement, cautious, measured, but undeniably different from the dismissal she had known before, and the shift did not overwhelm her, did not cause her to falter, because she had already stepped into this moment, already aligned herself with the reality it created, and now she simply stood within it, steady, composed, allowing it to exist without questioning whether she deserved it. And beside her, the presence remained unchanged. The quiet certainty that had brought her here now holding the entire room in place. And for a brief second, Lena allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, not as pressure, but as clarity, because whatever this was, whatever had begun at the edge of the hall, had now settled into something undeniable, something witnessed, something that could not be undone. And as the silence shifted once more, no longer waiting, no longer uncertain, she understood that the moment had already become something more than the ceremony itself, something that would not be measured by tradition, but by what came next. And for the first time, that did not feel like something to endure. It felt like something she was ready to meet. The change did not announce itself with sound, but with posture, with presence, with the quiet alignment of an entire room shifting into something new. And Lena felt it settle fully into place around her, not as something fragile anymore, not as something that might still unravel, but as something solid, something that had taken root in a way that could not be undone by doubt or question. And she stood within it without hesitation now, her shoulders steady, her gaze level, her breath calm in a way that no longer required effort, because the uncertainty that had once defined every step she took had been replaced by something clearer, something that did not ask her to prove her place, but simply allowed her to exist within it. And that difference carried a quiet strength she had never known before. And beside her, Cale Thornridge remained unchanged, not reacting to the room, not acknowledging the subtle shifts of attention or the silent recalculations happening in every corner, as if none of it required his focus, as if the outcome had already been decided long before anyone else realized it. And Lena felt that certainty again, deeper now, not as something borrowed from his presence, but as something she had begun to hold within herself, because whatever this moment had become, it no longer belonged only to him. It included her, fully, undeniably. And that realization settled into her, with a quiet finality that left no space for retreat. And across the hall, the officiant straightened, no longer uncertain, no longer searching for direction, because the structure had already been rewritten, and now it only needed to be acknowledged. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a new steadiness, not imposed, but accepted. Then we proceed. And the words did not attempt to return the ceremony to its former shape. They simply moved it forward within its new one, and the room followed, not with applause, not with celebration, but with a collective understanding that something significant had already occurred, something that did not require embellishment to be recognized. And Lena felt that understanding settle into her as well, not as pressure, but as clarity, because this was no longer a moment suspended between what was and what might be. This was something defined, something witnessed, something real, and she allowed herself, for the first time since stepping into the hall, to fully acknowledge what that meant, not in the distant uncertain way she had before, but in the immediate, undeniable sense of it, that she was no longer standing at the edge of anything, that she was no longer waiting for something to happen, because it already had, and the realization did not overwhelm her. It steadied her, grounding her in a way that made everything else feel sharper, clearer, more present, and she became aware of the way the room now looked at her. Not with dismissal, not with confusion, but with recognition, cautious and measured, but unmistakable, and she did not shrink from it, did not lower her gaze or step back into shadow, because there was no shadow left for her to return to, and more importantly, she no longer needed one. And that truth settled into her posture, into the way she stood, into the quiet strength that now defined her presence, and beside her, the steady weight of his hand remained, not changing, not shifting, but anchoring the moment in a way that required no further explanation, and for a brief second, Lena allowed herself to turn her gaze again, just enough to meet his, and what she found there was the same unwavering focus, the same controlled certainty, but now she understood it differently, not as something distant, not as something she observed from the outside, but as something she stood within, something that included her in a way that felt deliberate and unshaken. And that understanding held for just a moment before she looked forward again, not because she needed to, but because she chose to, because the moment no longer required her to seek confirmation. It simply asked her to stand within it, and she did, fully, completely, without hesitation, as the ceremony moved forward. Around her, no longer defined by the expectations that had once excluded her, but by the reality that had now claimed her place within it. It did not feel like an ending. Even as the ceremony began to move again around them, even as the officiant's voice resumed its place in the hall and the quiet rhythm of tradition attempted to continue, because something deeper had already shifted, something that could not be folded back into what it had been before. And Lena felt that truth settle into her with a calm certainty that replaced every question she might have asked just hours ago, because she was no longer standing at the edge of possibility. She was standing inside something that had already chosen its direction, and for the first time, she did not feel the need to understand every part of it to trust that it was real, and the realization moved through her slowly, not as a sudden rush, but as a steady clarity that grounded her in the moment, and she became aware again of everything around her, the soft murmur of voices returning in careful tones, the subtle movement of people adjusting to the new shape of the night, the flicker of torchlight casting long shadows that no longer seemed to hide her, but simply existed as part of the space she now occupied, and she stood within it without hesitation, without the quiet instinct to step back or fade away, because there was nothing left to retreat into, and more importantly, nothing left that required her to. And beside her, Cale Thornridge remained as he had been from the moment he stepped into her world, steady, unshaken. His presence no longer an interruption but a constant, something that had reshaped the entire room without needing to announce it. And Lena felt that presence not as something she leaned on, but as something she stood beside, equal in the moment if not in power, and that distinction mattered more than she could have explained, because it meant she was not being carried into this new reality. She was walking within it on her own terms, and that understanding settled into her posture, into the way her shoulders remained level, into the way her gaze met the room without flinching, and the people who had once looked past her now looked at her differently, not with warmth, not yet, but with something far more significant, recognition, cautious and measured, but real, and she did not need more than that, not now, because recognition was the first step in being seen, and she had already stepped into that space, already claimed it simply by standing where she stood, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of that shift, not as something overwhelming, but as something earned, something that had been built quietly over time through endurance, through silence, through the refusal to break even when no one was watching. And now, finally, someone had seen it, not by accident, not by chance, but with intention, and that intention had changed everything. And as the ceremony continued around them, no longer the center of the night, but no longer irrelevant either, Lena understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something she had never been allowed to imagine, something that would not be defined by the way others had once seen her, but by the way she now chose to stand within it, and the thought did not frighten her. It steadied her, because, for the first time, the future did not feel like something that would happen to her. It felt like something she would step into, deliberately, with the same quiet strength that had carried her this far. And as the final notes of the ceremony settled into the hall, blending with the low murmur of voices and the shifting of attention that still lingered on her and the man beside her, Lena Whitmore did not look away, did not step back, did not question her place. She simply stood exactly where she was meant to be, and in that moment, the girl who had once been invisible became something the entire room could no longer ignore, not because she had demanded to be seen, but because she had finally been chosen, and everything that followed would have to reckon with that truth.